I still remember the first time I heard about room 428. It was during my freshman year at Ohio University, a place renowned for its academic excellence and rich history. Little did I know, it was also infamous for something far more sinister. Wilson Hall stood proudly on the East Green, its ivy-covered walls whispering tales of the past to those who dared to listen. The rumors about room 428, however, were not whispered but spoken in hushed tones among students, as if even mentioning it too loudly might summon the dark presence said to reside there. It was a chilly October evening when I found myself standing in front of Wilson Hall. The leaves had turned to hues of amber and crimson, swirling around my feet as the wind howled through the ancient trees. I had always been a skeptic, dismissing ghost stories as mere fabrications, but the legend of the Shadow Man intrigued me. I decided to see if there was any truth to the tales. As I approached the entrance, I could feel a palpable sense of unease settling in my chest. The old wooden door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty scent of old books and forgotten memories. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each step amplifying the growing dread within me. Room 428 was on the 4th floor, tucked away in a quiet corner of the building. As I ascended the worn staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The legend stated that a shadowy figure haunted the room, appearing at night to those who dared to enter. Some said it was the ghost of a former student, while others believed it to be something far more malevolent. Finally, I reached the door. The number 428 was barely visible, the paint chipped and faded with age. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was surprisingly ordinary, furnished with a simple bed, desk, and chair. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the small window. I took a few steps inside, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to stay for a while, determined to see if there was any truth to the legend. I sat down on the bed, my eyes scanning every shadow and corner. Hours passed, and the room grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. The temperature dropped drastically, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at the doorway, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the dim light, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and indistinct, more a silhouette than a person. I couldn't make out any features, but its presence was overwhelming. My heart raced, and I found myself unable to move. The figure stood there, watching me, its shadowy form blending into the darkness of the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. The figure slowly began to move toward me, and I could feel the weight of its gaze. It was as if it was reaching into my very soul, pulling at my deepest fears and anxieties. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the figure vanished. The room was silent once more, the oppressive presence gone as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it my imagination, a trick of the light, or something far more sinister? I didn't know, but one thing was certain. The legend of the Shadow Man of room 428 was no mere tale. And I had a feeling that my encounter with the dark presence was only the beginning of something much more terrifying. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure. It haunted my dreams and invaded my thoughts. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had been a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Determined to find answers, I began to research the history of Wilson Hall. I spent countless hours in the library, sifting through old newspapers and archival records. The deeper I dug, the more unsettling the story became. Wilson Hall was built in the early 1900s, initially serving as a dormitory for students. Over the years, it had seen its fair share of tragedies. There were reports of unexplained deaths, mysterious disappearances, and even accounts of students driven to madness. But the most disturbing story was that of a student named Emily Reynolds. Emily was a bright and promising young woman who lived in room 428 during the 1960s. She was known for her intelligence and kindness, but also for her fascination with the occult. According to legend, Emily had been conducting a series of dark rituals in her room, attempting to contact spirits from beyond. One night, something went horribly wrong. Her roommates reported hearing blood-curdling screams coming from room 428. When they broke down the door, they found Emily lying lifeless on the floor, her eyes wide open in terror. There were strange symbols drawn on the walls, and the room was filled with an inexplicable cold. Ever since that night, room 428 had been plagued by the presence of the shadow man. As I read Emily's story, I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it be that her attempts to contact the other side had unleashed something truly malevolent? Was the shadowy figure I had seen somehow connected to her tragic fate? My obsession with the shadow man grew stronger. I needed to know more, to understand what had happened to Emily and why the dark presence still lingered in room 428. I reached out to some of the older faculty members, hoping to find someone who remembered the events of that fateful night. One evening, I received an email from Professor Samuel Adler, a retired history professor who had been teaching at Ohio University during the 1960s. He invited me to his home, promising to share what he knew about Emily Reynolds and the haunting of room 428. When I arrived at his house, Professor Adler welcomed me with a warm smile. His home was filled with books and artifacts, a testament to his lifelong passion for history. We sat in his study, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. "I've been waiting for someone like you," Professor Adler said, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "Someone willing to uncover the truth about what happened to Emily." He handed me a worn leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Emily," he explained. "It contains her thoughts, her experiments, and her descent into darkness. I believe it holds the key to understanding the shadow man." I opened the journal, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with Emily's meticulous handwriting, detailing her experiments with the occult and her growing obsession with contacting the spirit world. As I read, I could feel the weight of her fear and desperation. One entry stood out: "Tonight, I will attempt to summon the entity I have felt watching me. I must know who or what it is. I am terrified, but I cannot turn back now." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Emily had indeed summoned something, and it had claimed her life. But what was it? And why did it remain in room 428? Professor Adler leaned forward, his eyes filled with concern. "Be careful," he warned. "The shadow man is not just a ghost. It is something far more dangerous. Emily's journal may hold the answers, but it also holds great danger." As I left his house that night, clutching Emily's journal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to dance around me, and the cold wind whispered my name. The journey to uncover the truth about room 428 had only just begun, and I knew it would lead me into the darkest corners of Wilson Hall and beyond. The more I delved into Emily's journal, the more I realized how deeply she had become entangled with forces beyond her control. Her entries grew increasingly frantic, her handwriting more erratic. She described hearing whispers in the night, shadows moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread that never left her. The rituals she performed were attempts to understand and possibly control the entity she had inadvertently summoned. One night, as I pored over the journal in my dorm room, I came across a series of entries that made my blood run cold. Emily had drawn intricate diagrams and symbols, accompanied by detailed instructions for a ritual she believed would banish the entity once and for all. The final entry read, "I have no choice. I must try this tonight. If I fail, may God have mercy on my soul." I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to Emily. She had been just like me, curious, determined, and perhaps a bit too reckless. But unlike Emily, I had the advantage of knowing how her story ended. I was determined not to repeat her mistakes. Armed with the knowledge from Emily's journal, I decided to return to room 428. This time, I wasn't going to confront the entity blindly. I planned to follow Emily's ritual, hoping it would finally lay the shadow man to rest. The next evening, I gathered the necessary items for the ritual, a mixture of herbs, candles, and a piece of chalk for drawing the protective circle. As I made my way to Wilson Hall, the campus was eerily quiet. The wind rustled the leaves, and the shadows seemed to lengthen as I approached the building. I entered Wilson Hall and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached room 428, I hesitated for a moment, steeling myself for what lay ahead. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was just as I had left it, but the atmosphere was different. It felt heavier, charged with an oppressive energy. I quickly set to work, drawing the protective circle on the floor and placing the candles at strategic points around the room. As I lit the candles, their flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls. Following Emily's instructions, I began to chant the incantation she had written in her journal. The words felt foreign on my tongue, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. As I chanted, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The shadows around me seemed to pulse and writhe, as if reacting to the ritual. Suddenly, The candle's flames flickered wildly, and the shadows coalesced into a dark figure at the center of the room. The shadow man had returned, its presence more menacing than ever. I continued to chant, my voice rising in intensity as I willed the ritual to work. The figure began to move toward me, its shadowy form stretching and shifting. I could feel its malevolent gaze piercing through me, and a wave of terror washed over me. But I refused to give in. I held my ground, repeating the incantation with all the strength I could muster. For a moment, it seemed as if the shadow man was being repelled by the ritual. It hesitated, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. But then, with a sudden burst of energy, it surged forward, breaking through the protective circle. I was thrown back against the wall, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The shadow man loomed over me, its presence suffocating. I could feel its cold tendrils wrapping around me, squeezing the life out of me. Panic set in, and I struggled to remember the final words of the ritual. With a last desperate effort, I shouted the closing incantation. The room exploded with light, and the shadow man let out a deafening roar. The dark figure disintegrated into a swirl of shadows, which were sucked into the center of the room and disappeared. I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The room was silent once more, the oppressive presence gone. I had done it, I had banished the shadow man. But at what cost? As I picked myself up, I knew that the darkness I had encountered was far from ordinary. The ritual had worked, but it had also opened a door I couldn't close. I left room 428, the weight of my experience pressing heavily on my shoulders. I had survived, but the encounter had changed me. The legend of the shadow man was no longer just a story. It was a stark reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some mysteries should remain unsolved. But this wasn't the end. The shadow man was gone, but the darkness remained. And as long as Wilson Hall stood, there would always be those drawn to its secrets, just as I had been. The final chapter of this haunting tale was yet to be written. I thought I had banished the shadow man for good, but the unease never truly left me. I moved on with my life, graduated, and left Ohio University behind. However, the memories of room 428 clung to me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the darkness I had faced. Years passed, and I tried to forget. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye or feel an inexplicable chill. I dismissed these occurrences as remnants of my haunted past, echoes of a time I had desperately tried to leave behind. One stormy night, while I was alone in my apartment, the power went out. I lit some candles and sat down to read, trying to distract myself from the howling wind and the patter of rain against the windows. As I flipped through the pages of an old book, I heard a familiar creak, like the sound of a door opening. My heart raced as I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned around slowly, and there, in the dim light of the candles, I saw it, the shadow man. He was standing in the doorway, just as he had in room 428, his form as dark and menacing as ever. The terror I had felt all those years ago came rushing back. I backed away, but the shadow man moved closer, his presence suffocating. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, freezing me in place. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow man did not speak, but I could feel his intent. He was not just a ghost, not merely a lingering presence from my past. He was something much darker, something that had followed me, biding its time. I remembered Emily's journal, the rituals, and the incantations. I had banished him once, but clearly, it hadn't been enough. The shadow man was tied to me now, a part of my very being. Desperation took hold, and I began to chant the incantation from memory. The words felt weak and powerless, but I had to try. The shadow man advanced, his form flickering and shifting in the candlelight. My voice grew louder, more determined, but the darkness seemed to absorb the sound. The candles flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I could feel the shadow man's cold grip tightening around my heart. I struggled to breathe, to keep chanting, but the darkness was overwhelming. Just as I was about to give in, a surge of strength welled up inside me. I shouted the final words of the incantation, putting all my will into the chant. The room filled with blinding light, and the shadow man let out a deafening roar. The light intensified, and I felt a tremendous force pulling the shadow man away from me. His form disintegrated, the darkness swirling and dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence finally gone. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The candles had been extinguished, and the room was plunged into darkness, but it was a different kind of darkness, a peaceful, natural darkness. The shadow man was gone, truly gone this time. In the aftermath, I realized that the darkness hadn't just been in room 428. It had been within me, feeding on my fears and doubts. By facing it, I had not only banished the shadow man but also freed myself from the shadows of my past. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in years. The storm outside had passed, and a calm silence enveloped my apartment. I knew that the legend of the shadow man would continue to haunt the halls of Wilson Hall, but it would no longer haunt me. I moved forward with my life, carrying the lessons I had learned. Some doors should never be opened, and some mysteries should remain unsolved. But sometimes, facing the darkness is the only way to find the light. And so, the tale of the shadow man of room 428 came to an end. Yet, somewhere in the quiet corners of Ohio University, his story would live on, whispered among students as a cautionary tale. But for me, it was a chapter finally closed, a haunting memory put to rest.